about how they saved monetary policy. Now, if you are new to my channel, this is going to be information that probably just blows your mind. If you've been with this channel for any length of time, this is information that you have probably heard before. But to understand what is taking place right now within the Federal Reserve's monetary policy is incredibly important to know what was taking place just a few years ago within their own statements coming from the Federal Reserve about the issues that they were facing. And so I'm going to cover this again because hearing the Federal Reserve talk about how it is that they are data dependent to see whether or not they are going to be cutting interest rates going into the future, I think this is part of the manipulation game that they are playing. So understand that just a few years ago in 2018, the Federal Reserve had this to say. Today, we face an altogether different set of problems stemming from a very low neutral interest rate, that is, the short-term real interest rate consistent with an economy operating at its potential alongside low and stable inflation. Ironically, the problem we need to solve these days is the risk of inflation that is too low rather than too high. That's right. They were facing a problem with their monetary policy with an inflation that was persistently too low rather than too high. He actually talks a little bit more about it here later on in the speech where he says this. Oops, let me bring it back up. All right. It has this to say: the downward shift in inflation expectation has a second round effect on real interest rates. Now, this is important to remember because the Federal Reserve is not just looking at the Fed funds rate, and they're not just looking at inflation or inflation expectations, but they are also looking at something called the neutral interest rate. That is the rate when they are neither accommodating nor restricting the economy. Listen to what he says there. The real interest rate is the rate after the inflation. So let me give this, let me kind of explain it a little easier for you. If you were an investor who was anticipating you were going to get a 2% return, but you had an inflation expectation of 1%, the real interest rate that you would receive on your investment is 1%. If you lower the inflation expectation to 0, you would raise the real interest rate to 2%. Does this make sense? See, understanding it from this point of view is how the Federal Reserve is looking at it. So it's important to also see it from this point of view if you want to understand what the monetary policy is and to be able to make decisions based on your expectations of what that monetary policy is going to be going into the future. Now, many people think that they made a mistake, and if you're making your decisions based off of somebody else's mistake, then you have to go with them screwing up the entire time, and therefore you can never use this information for any kind of valid purposes anyway. So, understanding that they did this on purpose, that the position that they are now sitting in was one that they wanted to be in, and to understand why they wanted to be here is very important to go back and to read speeches like this one. So it says it again: this downward shift in inflation expectation has a second round effect on real interest rates, the economy, and inflation. When policy is constrained by the effective lower bound, the downward shift in inflation expectation raises the real interest rates. This is important. Again, listen to what he just said. The downward shift in inflation expectations raises the real interest rate. So if your expectation of inflation falls, the real interest rates rise. This is important because everything be opposite, right? If inflation expectation rises, it lowers the real interest rate. This is how they are operating today within the economy, pushing ever-increasing amounts of elevated inflation expectation. How many Fed governors and Fed officials have come out just recently saying, we don't know, data dependent, we like to cut, got to see what's going on, don't know what's going on with tariffs, uncertainty, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, raises the inflation expectation and lowers the real interest rates. Again, this is something that John Williams was talking about back in 2018. This is the speech Monetary Policy Strategies for a Low Neutral Interest Rate World, given November of 2018. Right? This is the problem that they faced and the issues that they needed to solve. He goes on to say, the downward shift in inflation expectation raises the real interest rates further diminishing the degree of monetary stimulus, making the downturn worse and reducing inflation even more. Oh, poor Federal Reserve, stuck in a bad situation. Let me read it again. When policy is constrained by the effective lower bound, here's the important part, the downward shift in inflation expectation raises the real interest rates, further diminishing the degree of monetary stimulus, making the downturn worse and reducing inflation even more. Major problem that they were facing. And this is what's so amazing. Most people would look at this information and discredit it. Throw it out saying, oh, they're liars, they're jokers, they're stupid, right? And then meanwhile, they're pulling it off. They're totally pulling it off. Your elevated inflation expectation is saving their ass. Even in times when policy is not constrained, the expectation, right? Even because people are like, well, that's the lower bound, dude, that he's talking about. No. Right? He goes in to say, even in times when policy is not constrained, the expectations of below target inflation in the future affects current decisions, putting additional downward pressure on inflation. In other words, monetary policy is always swimming upstream, fighting a current of too low inflation expectation that interferes with achieving the target inflation rate. The poor Federal Reserve had an issue. In 2018, they desperately needed inflation. They needed it to save their monetary policy. They were operating at the lower bound of zero with a low neutral interest rate, and they had no way of actually stimulating the economy because of the low inflation expectation. Did they not solve their problem? Elevated inflation expectations are now prevalent within the economy. Well, what does that do, right? The downward shift in inflation expectation has a second round effect on real interest rates. When policy is constrained by the lower bound, the downward shift in inflation expectation raises the real interest rates, further diminishing the degree of monetary stimulus, making the downturn worse and reducing inflation even more. Well, let's read that opposite. Right? Let's read it so in case we don't have a low inflation expectation, but instead have a high inflation expectation like we do now. What would he say through this speech, right? Well, if the downward shift in inflation expectation raises the real interest rates, the upward shift in inflation expectation would lower the real interest rates, further increasing the degree of monetary stimulus, making the increase or the growth better and increasing inflation even more. That's reading exactly opposite of what it is that he said about a downward shift in inflation expectation. Now, that seems very odd, right? That an increase in inflation expectation would somehow stimulate the economy. Like everybody, 99.9% of the people see it opposite of that. The Federal Reserve is trying to slow the economy down, bring inflation down by having elevated interest rates. That's the way it goes. But yet, the Federal Reserve sees it much differently. See, if you have elevated inflation expectations, well, you will raise that neutral interest rate. If the Federal Reserve is standing still and the neutral interest rate rises, it makes the economy less restricted. Here it is, John Williams was saying the problem that they were facing was the opposite of that situation. They had too low of inflation expectation. It was interfering with their monetary policy. Well, now they got elevated inflation expectation and they're back there singing, yes, sir, we're pulling it off. And see, now we have to think, who are they really pulling this off for? They're not pulling it off for us. The 90% of the people, they don't get to experience the awesomeness from this, right? Who gets to experience this? Well, those would be the capitalists and the property owners. People who have deployed their capital into capital investments for a return on those higher interest rates, and the property owners who are getting their assets to be elevated in price and having a high return on their rent. See, this is more about the 10%. If you looked at monetary policy From the position of the 10%, it all makes so much more sense. Do you remember when Donald Trump said the Fed should be lowering interest rates, they should take interest rates into negative territory, and that the rich people know what he's talking about? It's because everything that has to do with monetary policy is really focused in on the top 10%. And I understand that we wish we were important to them. We don't do enough commerce to be important to them, not as an individual. 10% of the people, 10% of the wealth, the top 10% do 50% of the consuming. Why would they be paying attention to 90% of the people when they can just focus in on the 10%? See, that's why it's so difficult for a lot of people to understand why it's going down the way it is because most people, especially in the 90% category, are not capitalists. They're not deploying capital into investments to get a return on it. They're not property owners. And because we're not capitalists and we're not property owners, we have a difficult time understanding why they're making decisions the way they do. We think, man, why don't they do things to get our paychecks to go further? It's because they're not interested in getting your paycheck to go further. That's not their interest. They don't care about that part. What they care about is making sure that the 10% continue to do the consuming because they're doing 50% of it. And if they focus out of that, then they're going to miss out on the opportunities to have consumption taking place within this economy if they stop focusing on the 10%. That's why we're not important. I wish it wasn't that way. I really do. See, there was a time in this country it wasn't that way when we were important. We were working class individuals who produced the world's greatest stuff, sent that stuff out there to the world, and the world sent us their money, and we were living in a very good standard of living for a regular, average, everyday Joe. That's not the way it works nowadays. Right? I mean, the idea that you can have a normal, average job, be somewhat disciplined, save your money, put a down payment on a house, you still would not be earning enough money to make the payments. It's like, there's no way. You have to have so much more going on in your life. You have to have your day job, you have to have side hustles, you have to have another job. Right? This is what you have to do in order to become the property owner or a capitalist. And it's a lot easier to become the capitalist nowadays than it is to be a property owner. But the difficulty of this, there we go, is going to get worse going into the future because the inequality is going to get worse so long as new money continues to pour into the system. Very little doubt in my mind about it. That's why it's so important to become a capitalist nowadays, because becoming a property owner is very difficult. Right? I mean, how is it you're supposed to come up with all the money down and then continue to make the payments on it and then maintain this property unless you're renting it out to somebody else? Because working a day job, that's going to make it almost impossible for you to do. Now, you can download all kinds of online brokers to buy stocks and bonds and whatever it is that you can find places to deploy your money. And if you're not doing that from an early age, you're going to get left behind because there's lots of people who are doing it. And as you start to find yourself competing against the people who decided that they weren't going to go to the bar, that they weren't going to blast their money off on stupid experiences, but instead take that money and turn it into stocks and bonds and investments out there, the more they do that from a younger age, they are going to separate themselves from the working class as well. The working class is going to find themselves in a position in which that they have to do ever increasing amounts of more effort in order to compete against the people who decided that they were going to participate within the investment, communities. I mean, I don't know how else to explain it. The idea that there was a time when an individual could graduate high school, go and get an average day job, work that average day job for a certain amount of time, be able to participate in the idea of being a property owner. Those days are gone. There might be some areas that you would still be able to find a decent paying job in a decent area in order to acquire that of what would be believed to be the American dream, but the chances of that happening are very slim. Right? There's only a few isolated places in the nation in which that you can do that. So understanding that your day job isn't going to be enough. There is no administration out there that can make the situation better for the working class individual to then bring back this return of renaissance, that your average day job is going to be enough to provide for the entire family. Never going to happen again. Not here. Okay? So knowing that from the very get-go, knowing that the Federal Reserve was trying to be in a position to save their monetary policy by creating an elevated inflation expectation, this is now the ability, giving you the ability to make most appropriate decisions for yourself. If your decision is being one of, I'm going to wait for the crash because all these people are stupid and they don't know what they are doing, right? Take it into consideration that the Federal Reserve was asking for monetary policy to be positioned exactly the way it is today. If they are stupid, they pulled it off with their stupidity. Brody, thank you so much for being here. We got all-nighters up in Alaska, so we may be missing out on all-nighter being in the chat and the comment section for a couple of weeks and months while he's up there doing his Alaska trips. Let's read through some of these comments. All right. Maybe print the money for the working people so they have first access to the money. Hey, Zeus, what that would do is it would actually make the problem even worse, because when you give money to the poor, what they do is they don't do the right thing. Now, whatever the right or wrong thing is, I guess that's a matter of your opinion, but you give that money to the poor and almost guaranteed that they will not deploy that money into capital investments or property ownership. If they do it in any other fashion, if they deploy that money into any other position, it will go directly to the rich and they will separate themselves. That's what will end up happening. You give the money to the poor, they will go out there and spend it. They won't have the money anymore. It will float to the top and the rich will get richer and the poor will wonder why the inequality took place. If you inject new money into the system, guaranteed inequality. I don't care who you give it to first. If you give it to the rich, it'll create inequality. If you give it to the poor, give it a minute, it will create inequality too. There's zero chance of introducing new money into the system and bringing inequality down. No way. It can't happen. It does not work like that. It's directly against the underlying economic forces that is creating the inequality in the first place. Got to study up on Cantillon. Most real estate that goes into probate is ultimately sold. People who inherit houses generally don't keep them. Poor will spend the money at T-Mill. Right. It'll go, yep, I totally agree. First access goes to people who borrow money and invest it into cash flowing assets. That's right, Brody. That's exactly how they do it. The people who have first access to the money, there's only two ways you can go with it, right? You can spend it into a luxurious experience, buying a car, buying vacation, doing something with that money. You borrow the money, you spend it out there. You don't have anything to show for it except for debt and an interest payment. That's how a lot of people put themselves into debt slavery. Other people borrow that money and go and buy a rental property. So now the borrowed money is actually paying them a little bit of return. Right? Instead of having to come up with the interest payment, somebody else is making the interest payment and they're actually getting a little cash flow off of it. So borrow money to buy cash flowing assets. If you're borrowing money to do anything else, it's the wrong decision. You know, other people are going to be borrowing money, getting that first access to that money and separate themselves from you. All right. Money, peanut, belongs to you. It belongs to the government and God. Brody, 80% of homes that are inherited or sold. Go do some basic research. All right. I mean, I don't know what the argument was going on with that one, but I'm assuming that it had something to do with maybe like the baby boomer generation, like the boomer generation passing away, and then those houses are going to come onto the market. However, it's from my belief that there is a lot of multi-generational like families living in these homes. It's not just a single boomer living in that house, but that actually has their kids too. Very true that house, even if it is inherited, could come up for sale. But the problem that a lot of people aren't thinking about when that is stated is that those people, if they're not going to live in that house, they still have to find another place to live. Even if they sell that house, they need another place. So when you think about it in this fashion, how many multi-generational families are living together? Right? Not just like, the couple, like, the old man and the old lady waiting to pass away in this house, this big old house or something, but have the kids living there or the grandkids living there, or even have somebody just helping to make the payment on the rent they got to live in there somewhere. That is happening more and more and more nowadays than just about any time in history here in the United States. And so you take that into consideration, there's going to be an underlying economic force that plays out within that itself. Where do those people go if they're not going to live in that house? They got to go find an apartment or something, which is again going to deprive the people who are living in apartments right now from being able to find them, right? Because it's still a demand for them. I mean, I imagine there's probably a bunch of them that, just have a single person living in it. When they pass away, it'll come up available. But I also wonder, like, how much demand for a living residence will come about when that person passes away and that house comes up for availability. Right? What time is it? I gotta go. Alrighty, guys, that's it for me. I got to go back to work. Thank you so much for being here. We got 169 people who are watching with 31 thumbs up. Thank you so much for hitting that thumbs up button. By hitting that thumbs up button, you get the YouTube algorithm to grab this video, spread it around for more people to join in. We can continue on with this conversation. Thank you again for everybody who has been hitting up on the podcast. I got the UE podcast going, so if you'd rather listen to these videos as opposed to watching them here on YouTube, you can always get access to the audio through the UE podcast. And thank you everybody who has been going over to Patreon and checking out the Patreon channel. I got a link down in the description for that as well. Trying to post a lot more over at Patreon. I'm not making any promises, but it is feeling good to get some activity going on over there, and I'm trying to be a little bit more active at Patreon. So thank you everybody who has become a Patreon member and helping to support the Uneducated Economist in that fashion. And then what else we got? We got the podcast, we got Patreon. We got the members only live stream. We're going to do a members only live stream this weekend where we cover the recent Christopher Waller speech. It's right here. What is the title of this speech? I got to go back to work. Oops. Oh, good. I put the cap on it. We'll be going over the effects of tariffs on the 3 I's: inflation, inflation persistence, and inflation expectation. Really good speech. We're going to break this down word for word in a members only live stream. So if you go and find the link down in the description to join the channel, it's $1 a month. You'll have access to all kinds of member only videos that we have done. And you'll have access to that weekend live stream that we're going to do probably Saturday or Sunday. I'll put a link up for it. Let's go check out the super chat real quick. Sleazicor, I love it. Trickbagger, $1.99. Started maxing Roth IRAs at 30. Will I make it? Well, I think you're probably going to be all right. I don't know how old you are now, but at 30 years old, if you got started, I think you're probably going to do pretty good. But don't make that your only thing. Like, you don't want to have that being like, I'm going to focus on that and forget everything else. You got to have other things going on as well. So, all right, you guys are awesome. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for hitting that like button. Thank you so much for the super chats. And thank you for all the support for the Uneducated Economist. You guys are awesome. You let me know.